Hello listeners, Sean here. Before we get to today's episode, I wanted to announce some pretty exciting news that will affect the show and its development going forward. Recently, the show was asked to join the Last of the Action Heroes podcast network. Think of it as a TV station of sorts that airs nothing but other like-minded podcasts, all focusing on the action heroes we all love and enjoy. The Last of the Action Heroes podcast network feed contains multiple shows focusing on Sylvester Stallone and the Rocky series. There are also shows looking at other cinematic action heroes, including Bruce Willis and James Bond. And there are still more on the way. So if you were already subscribed to the show on this particular feed, you can continue to do so as nothing is changing here. However, all future episodes are also going to be put on the Last of the Action Heroes podcast network. So feel free to check that out and subscribe, where you can also check out these other podcasts that also examine the careers of fellow action stars. So, with that out of the way, now on to today's conversation.
Who is the most underrated actor of all time?
It's Dolph Lundgren.
Correct. Why?
Well, because of his spiky hair and
Yeah.
his ice-cold demeanor and his big muscles.
Absolutely.
I must break you. The guilty will be punished.
My name is Sergeant Andrew Scott.
Come on, guys, don't do this. If I don't get breakfast, I get real grumpy. I don't think you like me grumpy.
And you go in pieces, asshole.
Let's kick some ass.
Hello and welcome back to I Must Break This Podcast, the fan podcast looking at the cinematic career of action legend Dolph Lundgren. Today is part 2 of our Expendables discussion, where we're once again chatting the action event of the decade in which Sylvester Stallone wrangled virtually every action star together in a film that delivered everything that fans of 80s and 90s action would want, including explosions, terrible one-liners, bone-crunching action sequences, and did I say explosions?
Give this job to my friend. He loves playing in the jungle.
Right.
A team of legendary warriors on a mission. They weren't expected to survive.
Get out of here, it's a miracle.
Let's see what you got.
Bring it.
Go. You know, it's not easy being your friend.
The Expendables, in theaters August 13th.
I'm your host, Sean Malloy, and with a film as game-changing as the original Expendables was, I felt that 2 episodes were almost necessary in fully discussing this film. So, closing out part 2 of this conversation, returning guests Chris Prentice and Matt Poirier are back to chat the film's pre-production as well as its effect on the action genre. So first up will be my buddy Chris Prentice. Chris and I go way back, and the general announcement, hype, and development of the Expendables excited us to no end. Chris and I reminisce on this period from 2008 to 2010, where we geeked out at the very idea of this film coming to fruition. After, Matt Poirier from the direct-to-video Connoisseur blog and podcast also returns. Considering the content and subject matter of Matt's podcast, I figured he'd be the perfect fit to discuss the effect that the Expendables had on the action genre, particularly the direct-to-video action market. The Expendables was a momentous event in film when it blasted onto the screen in 2010, and it created a sort of ripple effect in the genre, which is fascinating to examine in retrospect 11 years later. Dolph Lundgren in particular has had an interesting trajectory in terms of his films and roles post-Expendables. Thanks to the Expendables, Dolph was back on the big screen and was essentially rediscovered for many. This led him to carving out an impressive niche in the world of direct-to-video, where he starred in almost 40 projects of various capacities over the past 10 years. The end results of each of these projects have been a bit of a mixed bag to say the least, but they're still interesting to discuss on their own. In any case, this podcast here is going to be taking an interesting direction and turn as we embark upon the next stage and the most recent step in Lundgren's career. Needless to say, things are about to get interesting, folks, so please stay tuned. In any case, first up will be my conversation with Chris Prentice, followed by my chat with Matt Poirier on I Must Break This Podcast. All right, so joining me today is one of my best buddies and show regular, Chris Prentice, and we are here to discuss the hype, pre-production, and just general excitement surrounding the action extravaganza, The Expendables from 2010. Chris, it's always been a given that you would be on for this one, but this is going to be pretty cool to reminisce about this period here.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks again for having me on. And yeah, just kind of thinking back to, gosh, now it's been, over 12 years since it was, first announced that they'd be doing this movie, and kind of looking back at a lot of the stories that were associated before it started filming. It really kind of took me back. And I mean, there was just so many, wild rumors and so much, excitement and anticipation about this one. It's almost like there really hasn't been a movie like this since, at least for me. I mean, I don't get too pumped for a lot of the superhero movies that come out. I know that's what most people seem to get excited for these days, but this was kind of the one. This was sort of my geeked out, anticipated movie moment of at least this current millennium.
Oh, easily. Well, and there were a couple of ways I thought about going about this episode. I mean, obviously, I thought about doing a traditional, review analysis episode, kind of like what, we've been doing in the past for the past couple of years. And then I also had the idea, well, maybe I'll do like a round table discussion where I invite all sorts of the previous guests on and we kind of do like our own Expendables here with the episode. I think the big problem with that, if we did that though, is I think the episode would never end. Basically,
yeah.
It would just go on and on and on. So, yeah, I've kind of broken this down. You're going to be here. We're going to be discussing, obviously, the project's announcement, its overall production leading up to its release, and then I thought it'd be kind of cool to kind of look at the film's effect on the genre, particularly the direct-to-video genre. But let's just look at the entire conceit of this film, because I think that's really what the story of this entire film is. I mean, that the entire movie, I think we can admit, is a gimmick. Okay, I mean that's all the movie really is. It's a great big gimmick, but can we say it's an amazing gimmick that surprisingly really hadn't been put on screen yet? Basically, Sylvester Stallone came up with the idea of putting together an action movie with the ultimate ensemble cast of action stars from yesteryear, and I don't even really think he had a story or a plot in mind, after this initial gimmick. I mean, like I said, the plot is the gimmick. And obviously we can look back at films like The Magnificent Seven as attempting something like this. But I think this particular film, The Expendables, I mean, this was the ultimate Magnificent Seven, if you will, but for the new millennium.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I know that I've heard Sly joke, and this is more recently, where he has joked about, saying, oh, well, I got this idea for Expendables when I went to one of those, classic superstars of rock concerts. They have all the old bands that get together, and for one night you've got 5 or 6 of these kind of has-been bands, and he kind of thought to himself, I would never pay to see one of these bands by themselves, but you put them in one show, and I would go. And whether that's actually true or he's just kind of being goofy, I don't know. But I mean, that is kind of the truth. I mean, a lot of these guys weren't really able to open a movie on their own. So, throwing them together and having them all in this one big epic showdown, it was kind of a stroke of genius. I think it's the kind of thing that at least people from our generation, if you were kind of grew up in the 80s, you kind of always wondered, why isn't Sly in a movie with Arnold and with Bruce Willis and with Chuck Norris, and from back in those days, why can't they all just do a big movie together? And obviously it's because back then you had all these massive egos and nobody really wanted to let anyone else get over on anybody. And then it becomes an issue of money, who's going to get the most money. But now, in 2008, when this was first announced, that wasn't as big a factor because a lot of these guys weren't getting the kind of exposure they were in the 80s. And so, to have a movie where you throw in so many of these guys together, I mean, it was a pretty genius.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, and for the life of me, I tried finding the interview and I couldn't. I could have sworn it was at like a Comic-Con that back in 2010 that all the guys attended, and I could have sworn that it was at this particular event where Stallone was talking about the impetus for this idea and how he came up with it. But I mean, I remember him saying this exactly what you said. Basically, when he was interviewed about this conceit and how he developed the idea. His idea was that, okay, you have all these action guys from yesterday, okay, and their careers are waning, and they were no longer kings of the box office like they once were. However, when you put them all together, okay, you have lightning in a bottle. And I think, like you said, that's the exact rationale and theory behind those rock supergroups. Okay, sure, no one is going to really pay. Well, excuse me, I don't want to say no one, but for example, Vince Neil, for example, I can't imagine that he is going to generate the same amount of buzz and the same amount of crowds and audiences that he would have, say, in 1988. However, if you pair him with, say, an Axl Rose and a Bret Michaels, okay, then you have something there, and then you have something that I think everyone is going to want to see. The fans, obviously, from the 80s and the early 90s, and then maybe the new people. I mean, that right there is lightning in a bottle. That is a great idea, I think.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's also important that it really wasn't just all the has-beens getting together, because he did, having Jason Statham, I mean, he was pretty much somewhat the action guy who was kind of rising up through the ranks at this point. I mean, he had kind of started with Transporter earlier in the decade, and so he was about 6 or 7 years into his run. So I think having a predominantly old school cast, but then bringing in somebody that the contemporary audiences and the younger people would have been more into with Jason Statham, I think that helped quite a bit, because that added some legitimacy that, it's not just old timers day. We are kind of bringing in sort of the new wave of action stars as well. And so I think Statham he was the epitome of that angle at that point, which I think that was actually pretty key to the movie's success, was having not only all the old school guys coming together, but also having what I would call, quote unquote, the young buck with Statham.
Exactly. Well, this was announced in the fall of 2008 and was set for a release in 2010. So you and I, man, we were geeking out about this. I'll never forget. I mean, because you and I have been buddies, obviously, since before this. But I remember when they announced this, you and I were pretty much on Expendables watch, if you will, constantly going online and looking at the new developments and everything like that regarding this particular project. I think you're kind of like me in the fact that, okay, I grew up with these action guys, okay? Guys like Dolph, guys like Stallone, Schwarzenegger. I mean, these dudes essentially shaped my childhood. So the very conceit of these guys together, I mean, that sold me. I mean, and this is something that I think you said, a couple years ago, you and I were talking, but these guys were essentially our cinematic superheroes before comic book superheroes were being brought to life on the big screen. I mean, obviously, when I was a kid, we had Michael Keaton's Batman and we had Christopher Reeve's Superman and then Lou Ferrigno's Incredible Hulk, but that was pretty much it. Before comic books were being brought to life. These were our superheroes, okay? These guys, I mean, if you take a look at guys like Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Dolph Lundgren, these are these rarefied beings with godlike physiques, okay? I mean, these were all, individuals who young boys like us who grew up in the 80s and the 90s looked up to. It's kind of an interesting shift how today we have the actual superheroes like Captain America, Iron Man, Thor on screen. But, back in this glorious period, it was these action guys let's be honest too, Chris, it was these action guys whose name alone could not only sell, but open a movie. I mean, that right there is just amazing. It was just those guys, their name alone, no matter what the project was, it was always the next Schwarzenegger picture, the next Stallone picture, the next Dolph Lundgren movie. And so if you look at it, it's just a bizarre climate shift, how when you go to the early 2000s, suddenly the comic book characters began becoming their own thing. And it was the franchises that were suddenly muscling out these action guys.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I kind of liken what's happened with the traditional action movie from the 80s and 90s. I sort of look at what's happened to that today as to what was happening to the Western back in the 80s and 90s. The Western was such a big part of motion pictures from, in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And, once Clint Eastwood started to get on the scene with his Dirty Harry films, and then you moved on to where it was Arnold and Sly, and then on to Van Damme and Seagal. I mean, those sort of action movies, I think, really kind of ushered out the Western and kind of put them out to pasture. And unfortunately, I think it's been the same with the superhero movie. I think pretty much starting with X-Men. I mean, some people would say there was Blade before that, but Blade in a way is almost kind of a mixture of you've got a traditional action star with Snipes melded with a comic book character.
And Blade really isn't a comic book movie. I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but
you're right.
Really not. What's funny about it is if you look at Blade, the first Blade movie, that one's more like a neo-noir horror kind of movie thing. And then if you look at Blade 2, that's where it started leaning into its comic book roots because you had X-Men and Spider-Man preceding it. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, really with X-Men was where I feel like that's kind of what really ushered in this movement towards the comic book films because, a couple of years after that, you had Spider-Man and it just moved on and on and on. And basically slowly over time, maybe not even slowly, it was actually pretty quick that basically the old school style of martial arts or cop action movies were basically phased out, and now everything is about superheroes. So, that was another reason why the Expendables was so exciting, was because after so many years of, basically having all these superhero movies kind of rise to prominence, it was like, okay, finally, we're going to get all these guys in one movie. It's going to be old school action. It's going to be, martial arts with Jet Li. You're going to have big shootouts, big explosions, car chases. And, that's, again, like you, I mean, that's the era that I was raised in. I mean, these guys were larger than life. They were essentially our superheroes. And even though it was very rare, aside from maybe like a Universal Soldier, where it was very rare that these guys were ever in a movie together, I always kind of felt like their movies were in the same universe. Like I always kind of felt like, Commando was in the same world with Marked for Death, with Rambo 2, with Showdown Little Tokyo. I mean, maybe the locations might have been different, but I always kind of felt like, it's all happening in this same crazy universe where, that's just full of soldiers and martial artists and renegade cops. And so that, in a way, was kind of my shared cinematic universe, way before Marvel was doing it.
Well, and if you take a look at the overall concept of the film, or the general plot, if you will, I mean, it is extremely simplistic. I mean, I'm convinced that, again, I think Sly was, when he came up with this idea, he was kind of going about it the canon way of doing things. Okay, we have the stars attached. We have the idea for a cool poster. all right, let's kind of eke out an idea for a story here or there, okay? Because it's a soldiers on a mission film, similar in story to something like the Dirty Dozen, where Stallone is the leader of a group of mercenaries who are hired to take on dangerous jobs that organizations won't. Like I said, it's an extremely simple conceit, which I think is okay considering, let's be honest, Chris, really the main story of this film is, can you believe they've gotten all these guys together? Like, I think that is the main story. And to be honest, I don't know how much of a premise for this thing was really even necessary. I mean, as I watched it again, as I look upon it, the film really could have almost been meta, with all of these stars essentially just playing themselves and going on an adventure, which in the end is basically what this film is.
Yeah. I mean, the story, there's really nothing too original about the story. The story is very much, this is a much smaller movie, but it's almost the same as I don't know if you ever saw the Christopher Walken film, The Dogs of War, where he's essentially a mercenary, has to get a team together, and they have to go overthrow a dictator. And obviously that movie doesn't have the bombastic streak of the Expendables, but it's the same essential plot line. It's a group of mercenaries, got to overthrow a dictator, mayhem ensues. And so I think, that's not really the selling point. The selling point is having all these people together. In fact,
it's a gimmick.
Yeah. I mean, when you look, I was looking back at when the project was first announced in November of 2008, and it was announced at the American Film Market, which I guess they still have, though it's kind of one of those aspects of movies that's on fumes at the moment, where new things were announced. And basically the poster, they had a little poster that was run from different websites, kind of trumpeting the project. All it is just the names, Stallone, Statham, Lee, Expendables. I mean, that's basically it. That's all that's on there. It's just a black poster with their names and the name of the movie. But that was enough to really kind of set the spark. And also, 100%. And, and then also I think another big reason, why this was anticipated was because, this announcement was, I guess maybe now this would have been about 9 or 10 months after the fourth Rambo film came out. And, that if you were an action fan, that Rambo film was huge. I mean, that was like, whoa. I mean, we're definitely going into a different stratosphere of carnage with this fourth Rambo film. And so I think people had kind of a high from that. At least if you were into action movies, you had a pretty good high from that fourth Rambo. So when you see that, the next film from Stallone is not only going to be him, but also Statham and Jet Li, and then you're thinking of these images of the fourth Rambo film. I mean, I think it was just kind of a perfect storm. It was just the right time for this kind of project to get going.
Well, that's an excellent segue there, because when this project was first announced, it was basically just three. It was Stallone, Jet Li, and Jason Statham, which, look, I love the cast that was assembled for this, but I think if it would have just been those three, I think in the end that certainly would have made a lot of sense at the time, because if you remember, like you said, Sylvester Stallone had a big career resurgence thanks to the fourth Rambo movie, and Jet Li and Jason Statham, they had just come off of the film War. Okay, and so it only made sense that that Stallone here is doing this particular film and is aligning himself with these two guys, because I mean, I was going to get to it in a minute, but Lionsgate picked this film up eventually for distribution. Of course, I don't know about you, but it was never a question to me who else was going to be handling this one. In my mind, Lionsgate was the only company who could properly handle a project like this. So,
yeah. Totally. I mean, they had put out Rambo, they put out War. They were doing not all of Statham's movies at that time, but a lot of them, like Crank, and they actually also put out The Third Transporter, and they had also done some other Jet Li films. So it just seemed like a natural fit that's the company that would end up releasing this movie when it was completed.
The Condemned. I don't think The Condemned gets a lot of attention, but I think that one's very underrated as well.
That's another one. Yeah, I mean, they had, in fact, that was one of their big pushes when this movie came out. I'm sure you remember, is Lionsgate reissued a whole lot of the back catalog movies featuring the guys from the Expendables, and they would had their, at a much reduced price, basically saying, hey, own Lockup, own Johnny Handsome, own Universal Soldier, with featuring a star from the Expendables. So yeah, it was a total natural that this would be a Lionsgate film.
But then it was announced, if you remember, that Dolph Lundgren was added. Okay, so you had the initial core three. You had Stallone, Statham, Jet Li, and then it was announced that Dolph Lundgren was added. This excited me to no end, mainly because this was Dolph's big return to the big screen. It was eventually announced that he was going to be playing the character named Gunnar Jensen, which the names of the characters in this film we'll get to in a minute. The names of the characters are hilarious, but yeah. So for a very brief period, there were the four. It was going to be Stallone, Jet Li, Jason Statham, Dolph Lundgren, and for that brief period before the other cast got announced, again, that was pretty cool. It was like, okay, this is going to be a pretty cool and exciting project. I don't know where it's going to go story-wise other than, soldiers on a mission, but this could be pretty cool. Or excuse me, this is going to be pretty cool.
Yeah, well, kind of looking back at how and at all these kind of stories unfolded and at the order of things, what's interesting is that, so you had the initial announcement of the main three. Now, the next name that was hyped up, that was basically associated with this project for a long time before it basically came out that now it's just not going to happen because of scheduling issues, was Forrest Whitaker. He was on board. I mean, it seemed like he was on board, and this was, coming relatively soon after he had won an Oscar. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, that'd be pretty sick. I like Forrest Whitaker. I mean, he had actually just been on The Shield. He was great on The Shield. And I thought, oh, okay. I mean, even though he's not a quote unquote action star, I was like, okay, I think this is going to be pretty cool to have him. And then, I think it was a couple weeks after that the Dolph Lundgren news came out, and that just sent this from a 10 up into a 20 in terms of anticipation. I mean, it just kind of broke the meter because it was like if you're a fan of this guy, you hadn't seen him on the big screen since Johnny Mnemonic, and he had been making up to that point, he had been making some really good direct-to-video action movies. And so hearing that he was going to be a part of this and he was going to be included with this ensemble, it totally just amped things up. I mean, it was already a highly anticipated project, and it just put it into a whole other level.
Well, and this is also I would like to say, this is also kind of the positive and also the negative with the internet. Because, look, when this project was announced, thanks to the internet, I mean, fans like yourself and me, we were, like I said earlier, we were on quote-unquote Expendables watch for the better part of 2 years. Okay, and so we were constantly, on the internet. There were various set reports and various articles about the project being in production. And so, while granted, that is exciting, but the problem with that also is that by the time the movie came out, I felt like, at least with me, I felt like I had seen everything already. I knew all of the characters' names. I pretty much knew all of the characters' arcs that were going to be associated with all of these characters. And, while it was fun being given a bird's eye view into the production, I will admit that a little bit of the movie's magic, for me at least, was lost by the time I saw it. I mean, for example, one of the big plot points in the film that was announced in the early stages, even before it even started shooting, was that Dolph Lundgren and Jet Li were going to have a fight scene. Yeah. Why would you spoil that? That was always my biggest complaint. Why would you spoil something like that? And so by the time, again, I saw it on the big screen, I knew it was going to be happening. I knew it was coming. And so I don't know, man. You and I were talking about this the other day. It's stories like this kind of movie journalism and behind the scenes that makes me kind of long for and miss the days where all we would get were a poster, a trailer. If we were lucky, maybe a 2.5 minute behind the scenes stint on Entertainment Tonight, and that would be it. But this film, man, I mean, I'll be honest right now, I feel like the anticipation and the hype leading up to the actual movie was almost, for me at least, more exciting than the movie itself.
Well, I mean, I definitely get what you're saying. This was a movie that I probably followed the day-to-day filming as close as any other movie that I can think of. And part of the reason for that is because there was so much content available. I mean, going back, I mean, there were so many websites that would have their, set visits. We're on the set of the Expendables and we're going to do 5 days of coverage, a different interview every day with somebody. And that whole kind of era is over. I mean, there really isn't those kind of set visits. I mean, websites just don't do that. There's just no money in it anymore for that kind of content. But back at this point, in when this was, first announced in 2008 and then eventually filming in 2009, I mean, you literally every day you could get photos, you could get interviews, and who's filming this day. Oh, what scene is this? Oh, Mickey Rourke is leaving the set of Iron Man 2 for a weekend so he can go film his part. And
so you hear that. I mean, I'm sorry again. You hear that, and then you think, okay, well, if he's only leaving for a weekend, that means he's only going to be on screen maybe 6 minutes. You know what I mean? Like, so it's kind of like there's no surprise there.
No, it's true. It's true. And then I'll go a little further in that. I had a friend who at the time was living in New Orleans and actually did some work on this movie, some behind the scenes work. His name was Casey, and he actually sent me the script for this movie. And I've always been one of these people who are like, oh, I don't want to read the script before, the movie is out. I mean, I see people online, if there's a Batman movie or this movie, oh, I read the script, it's going to be something. It's like, well, why would you want to read that before you see the movie? But I'll tell you, when I got that script in the mail, I was reading it right away. So
you sent me a copy.
I know, I was no better. I was no better at all. And I basically, that was the actual film differed slightly with what was on that script, but so it was just a movie that was tailor made for hype and for excitement. And every new photo that would come out, there would be, oh, here's a new article about this photo, here's a new article about this, or hey, Gary Daniels is going to be in it, here's a new story about Gary Daniels being in the movie. It was just a different time. Looking back, was it overkill? Sure, but it's interesting to think back as to how movie journalism has changed in those 10 or 11 years now, because there's just none of that. Basically, if you're a site that's writing about movies, you just wait for studios to announce stuff, and then you write up stories about it. There's no more about the rumors, really. There's just not a lot of that. There's no more, oh, my source with this studio tells me this. It just doesn't happen much anymore. It's just everything is just waiting for whatever the studios are going to give you, and you just report on that.
Well, it's funny. Yeah, I remember you emailed me a copy of that script as well, and I quickly glanced through it as well. And going through all of these rumors and all these various announcements, that's kind of what became, again, exciting. But for me, it was also a little worrisome here, okay? Because it seemed like not a week went by where just more and more actors weren't getting added. Like, it just kept, I mean, this thing was a steamroller, okay? It was a train that just, more people just kept hopping on board it. And I remember something, there was an interview with the legendary screenwriter Stephen E. D'Souza, who wrote classics such as Die Hard and Commando. And I remember he said something really interesting in this interview. He said, why are there only 7 dwarves? Okay, if you look at the story, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, why are there only 7 dwarves? And he said the reason for that is because if there are any more than 7, the audience is going to lose track of the various characters, and they're going to forget about certain characters. And so I'll never forget reading that particular quote from Mr. D'Souza, and then looking at this project, and yeah, you had the core 4, okay? You had the Stallone, Statham, Lee, Lundgren, okay, who were on board. And then suddenly yeah, you kept getting more people. So if we just go down the list of people who were added, Randy Couture was suddenly added. And, this was something I was slightly hesitant about due to the fact that, okay, let's be honest, I don't want to mitigate his talents in the MMA ring or octagon, by any means. But I was thinking, well, Randy Couture is not really an action star. Like, okay. Yeah. And then suddenly Terry Crews was added. Now, what's interesting about Terry Crews' role is my understanding was that was initially supposed to be 50 Cent, but then I think due to the internet backlash, that announcement caused Sly and Company to kind of change that one and go with Terry Crews.
Oh yeah, look, I mean, I went over this stuff again recently, and so basically Forrest Whitaker was going to be Hail Caesar. I mean, that's what was going to happen.
Another great name.
Yeah, and hey, I would have loved to see Forrest Whitaker with these guys. I think that would have been great. But as things kind of progressed, the shooting schedule got a little later, and got to the point where Whitaker had to drop out. I had something else he had to make. I don't know, maybe he was going to film that Repo Men thing he did. I don't know. But he had to drop out. And so, yeah, that's when it was announced that it would be 50 Cent taking over. And I looked, I mean, it's just nuts how these things happen. So yeah, 50 Cent gets announced, and basically it was on an article in the Ain't It Cool News, where Stallone at that point, he was kind of feeding a lot of information to that site. He was pretty close with that site, and yeah, there was a huge backlash. People just did not want 50 Cent in this movie. No. And Stallone, there's you're probably familiar, I'm sure, with the Stallone Zone fan site, and he actually wrote basically a message on that site defending 50 Cent, saying that, people, you guys, everyone needs to calm down. You got to give this guy as a talented artist. You got to give him a chance. That he kind of likened what 50 Cent was going through with his own early career, where nobody wanted to give him a shot, and eventually somebody did, and he got Rocky, and that's kind of how he was basically explaining that 50 Cent is going to deliver. And I swear, 2 days later, 50 Cent out, Terry Crews in.
Yep.
I mean, it's I mean, I'm sure, I'm positive that the reason that it was 50 Cent was because he had done a few movies with Millennium at that point. He had done a cop movie with Val Kilmer, Streets of Blood, and he was also in Righteous Kill, the Pacino De Niro movie that we don't talk about it anymore. But he was also in that one, and so he kind of had a relationship with them. So I think it was basically, well, we can't get Forrest Whitaker. Hey, we've got a good relationship with 50 Cent. Let's go get him. But yeah, the backlash was quick, because it was just 2 days later that he was out and Terry Crews was in. So that's pretty wild.
God, well, and speaking of wild, isn't it just amazing how, these trolls on the internet have the ability in this day and age? I mean, now it's even more prevalent nowadays. I mean, if you look at what they did to the Sonic the Hedgehog movie, I mean, my goodness, but it's just amazing to me how, thanks to the internet, and especially nowadays, thanks to social media, how even when a project is announced and people sign on for it, it has the ability to just immediately get dogged right even before it's out the gate. I mean, and you and I have talked about this before, but I mean, look, the best example I can think of is Superman versus Batman. Now, there are some problems with Superman versus Batman, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but how is any film supposed to do well at the box office and get any kind of positive attention when even before it even starts filming, it is just getting dogged and trashed by the online community? It's really disheartening and really sad, in my opinion.
Yeah, it is, and that's why, looking back at Expendables, I mean, it's pretty shocking how it 100% was the fan backlash, and we're talking about just 2 days of fan backlash is what it took to get 50 Cent. And look, personally, I think Terry Crews is a better choice for the role, so I think it probably was the right move. But yeah, at the same time, it is very weird that such a big online backlash could have led to a major actor not being, or at least an actor, maybe not a major actor, but an actor not appearing in a major film. It's pretty wild. But these things have kind of gone on. I mean, obviously it's much bigger now because of the internet. But there was back in when Michael Keaton was announced to be Batman, people were nuts. They could not envision that. It was how in the hell is this guy who was Beetlejuice supposed to be Batman? And that we all know that turned out pretty well. So it's gone on for a long time. And I mean, I remember people flipping out when Daniel Craig was announced as James Bond. It was because at that point he had much blonder hair, and people were just incredulous that how are you going to have this guy with blonde hair playing James Bond? And there was a whole big furor about that, and that's for the most part turned out pretty well, at least in terms of leading to successful James Bond movies. So, the internet's always going to be full of stuff like that. But yeah, when it comes to this incident with the 50 Cent, I really had kind of forgotten about that. But reading some of this stuff now, it's just pretty wild how quick he was just gone from this whole production.
Well, with regard to Terry Crews, I will admit when I heard that initial casting, I thought to myself, well, he looks the part. I mean, he at least looks the part to where that he can hold court with all these guys. However, I also, in the back of my mind, was thinking to myself, okay, the most I've seen him in was like that Everybody Hates Chris show and White Chicks and whatnot. So when I heard of his casting, I remember thinking to myself, okay, there's going to be some tongue-in-cheek stuff in this movie. That's the only way it seems like Terry Crews has played his various roles. So I knew going in that he was going to be the comic relief of this film.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main part that I had known him for before this was as the president in Idiocracy, where he's hilarious.
Yeah, another comical role.
But I thought that, I mean, he's a larger than life personality, and I think honestly at the time I was just relieved it wasn't going to be 50 Cent, to be honest. Yeah. And so I was just like, hey, this Terry Crews way better. And I know I'd seen him in some other things too, like he was in that Christian Bale movie Harsh Times. He had a pretty decent role in there, and so he was definitely kind of on the rise at that point. It's funny. I look back at one of the articles that was talking about him being cast in the Expendables, and it was basically saying, oh well, Terry Crews is looking to make a move in the action genre. He'll also be seen in a couple months in Terminator Salvation. And I don't know if you remember, but there isn't a whole lot of Terry Crews to be seen in Terminator Salvation.
No.
So I don't know. I think thinking back now, that was pretty funny. But personally, I think he's one of the best parts of the movie. To be honest, I think he's outstanding. So, I mean, I think maybe there was a poor choice made with his character in one of the later movies, but in terms of the first one, I thought he fit perfect. I thought he was great.
Well, and then some of the other casting announcements. Mickey Rourke was also added as a character by the name of Tool. Rumor has it that as a favor to Sly, who had gone out on a limb and helped Mickey Rourke by insisting on Mickey Rourke's casting in the film Get Carter from 2000. That was fall of 2000 that was released. So that's kind of why it was kind of like a mutual arrangement where Mickey Rourke was like, "Hey, you scratched my back when I really needed it. I'm gonna help you out here." And then we also got, Eric Roberts as the main heavy alongside Steve Austin. And then in a very interesting bit of casting here, Brittany Murphy was briefly attached as Mickey Rourke's girlfriend. And so this, for me, again, going back to what Mr. Steven D'Souza said about the Seven Dwarves, I was thinking to myself, okay, if they're casting someone by the name of someone along with the likes of Brittany Murphy, the late Brittany Murphy, who was a recognizable name. Yeah. I'm thinking to myself, are there too many characters here in this entire mix? And I almost kind of wondered, would this be better as like a mini series or something like that? I mean, if they're casting a name like Brittany Murphy to play the girlfriend to Mickey Rourke's character, who ostensibly is on screen for maybe less than 7 minutes. Okay. Right. It was kind of like, okay, like, are they biting off more than they can chew here?
Well, but at that point, we didn't know really that Rourke was only going to be in it those few scenes. I mean, we really didn't have any idea. I mean, that him, if we think about it now, we think, oh, big deal, Mickey Rourke. I mean, God, what difference would it make? But when he was announced, this was right in the middle of when The Wrestler was getting all of the accolades. That this was right at that time when there was the awards push for Rourke for The Wrestler, and so this was a big upswing for him. And so him being announced as being part of this Expendables was big at that point.
Yeah.
And I definitely remember the Brittany Murphy news, and that just seemed kind of odd. But obviously, when you think back, it's like, was it a little too much? I really don't think so. I think this movie needed to have kind of too much. It obviously got absolutely crazy once they finally got to the third film, but for this one, I think they kind of needed to have a lot of just personalities in there to kind of just whet everyone's appetite. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but before it was Eric Roberts, I mean, do you remember who was going to be playing the main villain before him?
Oh boy, I'm gonna have to go back now. Who was it?
It was Ben Kingsley.
That's right. Right. That could have been interesting. Obviously, he wouldn't have been able to throw down with those guys, but he's proven he could be a very cold, calculating, menacing villain.
Yeah,
so,
no, I would have. I mean, if you could have had him in like that sexy beast kind of mode as the villain. I mean, I like Eric Roberts well enough. I mean, he was, and he was also in a somewhat better place coming right off of The Dark Knight when he was cast in this. But yeah, I think Kingsley would have been a blast. I mean, I think that was and then before Steve Austin, I found kind of again going through this stuff. Before Steve Austin was cast as essentially the number 2 bad guy, it was the Expendables 2 number 2 bad guy, Scott Adkins, who I saw was rumored to be playing Payne in this film. So, he eventually, I guess, got to do it in the next one, but I thought that was kind of interesting. That was something I hadn't really seen before, or at least not since, 10 or 11 years ago when this was all going on. But then eventually they went with Steve Austin, which, that was another kind of like Couture was a somewhat puzzling casting to me at that time. But I mean, at least Austin had a couple movies under his belt by then. And so, it was like, okay, that's fine. We'll throw him in there. It wasn't quite as much of a puzzler as Couture, but I don't know. I think I was mainly just looking for a lot more in terms of the older action guys in these parts. And even though, Stone Cold had done The Condemned, I didn't really quite have him in that league at that moment.
Well, and then, okay, another excellent segue there, Chris, because then it felt like it was near the tail end of the pre-production. We also got wind that Arnold Schwarzenegger and Bruce Willis were going to be getting cameos in this film as well. So that right there, those two additions, even though we knew that they were going to be small bit roles, that amped up the excitement and piqued, I think, a lot of people's interest because Arnold for one. I mean, he was still governor around that period.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's Well, when Arnold was announced, I'm looking kind of at this timeline. So he was announced, way before Willis because they filmed the scene with those three guys. That was well after everything else was shot. And so, Arnold was announced. And at this point, this was early 2009. This was right in the middle of, kind of the financial crisis that the country was going through. And it hit California very hard. And, Arnold was governor. And there was a lot of flack that he was catching when this was announced. And it was basically like, this state is going through such a financial collapse. And now you're going to go film a movie. And so, he was this was towards the end of his second term. So it wasn't really going to be something that would impact any kind of re-election because he just wasn't going to be able to run again. But it was just kind of interesting seeing that sort of angle that, Arnold was kind of catching a lot of flack for being a part of this. And then, it was about 6 months after Arnold that was when Willis was announced to be the church character. And so, all of that was filmed, I think well after the bulk of the movie had wrapped. But that was, again, those were announcements that were huge. And even though, we knew that it was just going to be a cameo, it was just, oh my gosh, we're going to see Arnold and Sly together on the big screen, even for just one scene. I mean, this is going to be pretty epic. And then, throwing Willis in there with them, and it's, basically, Planet Hollywood all over again.
Well, and okay, so the movie is filming, and obviously, like I said, we had kind of a bird's eye view into this thing. It's slated for a summer 2010 release, which is wild to think that was well over 10 years ago, actually. But
I know.
We have to talk about the trailer, okay,
yes.
that hit. The trailer that hit, man, this is a cool trailer. This is how you cut a trailer. Now, I had never heard of the band Shinedown, but that song Diamond Eyes it is so appropriate for the movie and its overall conceit. So I don't know who cut this trailer and who decided on that particular that particular track to accompany the trailer, but that was amazing. I will say, though, while I love the song that accompanies this trailer, I will say, in my opinion, I think it was a bad move, them spoiling the Schwarzenegger and Willis cameo in the trailer. I think this film would have done just fine, okay, on its own without that secret being spoiled. And in my opinion, I felt them spoiling that because that's the only scene they're in, okay, in the film. Right. And then for them to spoil that in the trailer, that was a bit of a letdown for me. But I guess I'll go to you real quick. What did you think of the trailer when it hit?
Oh, I loved the trailer. I mean, it basically delivered everything that I wanted. Obviously, I think the one complaint I had, being a huge Lundgren fan, is I wish there wasn't much, aside from when he gets, his name flashed on the screen, there really wasn't much of him. But aside from that, I mean, I thought it was awesome. I mean, it was basically, wow. I mean, this is all these photos I've been seeing and all these stories I've been reading. It's like, this is it. This is actually happening. Here is the first footage. And so I was blown away. And I actually disagree about having Arnold and Willis show up in there, because look, there just aren't really big secrets anymore. I mean, it just doesn't happen. I mean, I remember, I guess it was 2 years before this movie came out, when Iron Man came out, and Iron Man was a huge giant hit. It's going to be the first of these Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, gigantic. Everyone loves Robert Downey Jr. Well, the next movie that was going to come out was the Ed Norton Hulk movie, just about a month later, in which Robert Downey Jr. has a cameo towards the end of it. And basically there was an entire commercial that basically just showed Robert Downey Jr. in the movie, and showing him talking to William Hurt, basically telling you, look, Iron Man is in this movie, even though it's only for a minute, he's in this movie. So I just kind of feel like there just aren't the big surprises anymore that there used to be. But it didn't really impact my enjoyment. It actually made me more excited. It was like, oh my goodness, here we've got these three that are going to be sharing the screen together. Yeah, would it have been, cooler to have seen it first when the actual movie opened? Probably, but having it in the trailer only made me more excited for the movie.
Okay, now Chris, I have to ask then. Okay, I'm assuming you probably watched this trailer a few times, like I did as well. Did you go on iTunes and quickly buy the song Diamond Eyes like I did?
No, I didn't do that. No, I didn't do that. I just, but it was just a constant, let me watch that trailer again. Let me watch that trailer again. And this was, before having an iPhone and being able to just watch these things on your phone. So, it was basically, at my desktop, basically, okay, I got, a minute and a half to kill. Why don't I watch the Expendables trailer again? And so, there was a lot of that. And, it's a really well cut trailer. And, the gags that are in there, I think, work pretty well. It what more could you have wanted out of that trailer? I really, other than more Dolph, that was the one thing that there should have definitely been more of that. But aside from a little bit of a lack of him, I thought the trailer was excellent.
Okay, so August 2010 rolls around. I'm assuming you were there opening night, as was I. Without giving too much away or spoiling any of the moments in the plot or anything like that, just your general reactions. I guess, did it live up to your expectations, and what did you think?
It totally did. I mean, this was a one that I remembered seeing. Now it's well, nothing's open now, but back when movies were being shown in a regular fashion.
Remember those days? Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, that was just a year ago.
Pretty soon we'll be telling our children back in the day, we would watch movies on giant screens, and we'd go and we'd park our car.
Oh, it was, oh my goodness, yes. I mean, that's about where we're headed, it feels like. But there were showings at midnight on the Thursday night at midnight. Now everything that opens, there's like 8:00 showings essentially, so you can see it at 8:00, 10:00 the night before. But for this one, it was a midnight showing, and yeah, I mean, I was at that showing, and it was packed. I mean, it was, a lot of times some of these midnight showings I've been to, they're not all that packed, but this one was completely filled, and it totally delivered. It was great. I mean, the audience was into it. It was just fun. It was just a fun summer action movie. Look, are there flaws with it? Of course, there's definitely things that could have been better. But man, I think at its core, this was a movie that delivered. I mean, this was. Would this have been better seeing all these guys when they were in their prime back in the 90s? Yeah, it would have, but that didn't happen. So we make do with what they did, and all things considered, it was an absolute blast.
Well, to anyone who didn't understand the hype that was circulating around this film. I mean, I remember I met my wife when this film was in production, and so I was constantly, I met before it was my wife, and so pretty much she had to hear about the Expendables watch, I guess, for about a year or so. But to anyone who didn't understand the hype, or who just went to see this movie on a Friday night like they would any other movie, this film really was a love letter to not just action movies from back in the day, but also to action fans from the 80s and the 90s. And this has been a ton of fun, Chris. I mean, you and I go way back, but I had a ton of fun just throughout this period, from 2008 to 2010, really building up the hype with you, because none of my friends or anyone really at my work, I remember it was interesting because a lot of my colleagues and stuff, I was talking to them about it, like, have you heard about the Expendables? And they were like, well, no. And I'm like, oh, check this out. It has this person and this person. And they were just kind of looking at me like, okay, you know what I mean? And so it was cool that I was able to, kind of share this with you. And we were, that was a really fun period. And I had a ton of fun going back and watching this movie again, and just kind of reminiscing about that period, that 2-year period of building up the hype. And it's wild to think, here we are now, 10 years later. I mean, my God, a decade has passed.
Yeah.
But hey, it was a fun period, and here's to another decade chatting these movies with you.
Oh, absolutely. No, this was a blast. I really enjoyed going down memory lane and kind of thinking back to how exciting this whole process was, and all the different names that had been associated, and all the different stories. And it was a different era. It was kind of like Twitter was around, but it wasn't the big focal point that it is now. So it was just the way the news was disseminated was so different, and we'll never really, I feel, have that kind of coverage again. Everything is just very different now. But yeah, this was a lot of fun reminiscing about the whole hype that led up to the Expendables.
Yeah, it was certainly a lot of fun. And till next time, I really do appreciate it. But you take care, and we'll talk again soon. Okay.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Nice bird.
First of all, I don't feel comfortable talking business with a giant carrying a shotgun.
Pretty boy wouldn't give it up.
Not if you want to know where they are.
What do you know?
I just bit one of them.
Why are you turning on them?
Lover's quarrel.
We settle on 50.
No math whiz. We settle on $100,000 up front in my pocket.
Guy thinks he's a real badass.
This case is a bloody joke.
Life's a joke. Shit bird! If you don't want that Fu Manchu knocked back into the 60s, you better keep your gum chewing trap shut and show some respect!
Bring it.
Hey, be nice. Need a facelift, pretty boy?
All right, so coming back to the show once again for his sophomore round, I guess we'll say, is Matt Poirier from the direct-to-video Connoisseur blog and podcast. Matt, thank you so much for coming back, man.
Thank you, Sean. It's always great. Great to have. Thanks for having me. I should say thank you.
Well, this one, I mean, I should probably back up, and I should probably let you know the impetus for why I wanted to do this and everything. You know, the Expendables, I mean, let's just say it's hard to believe, but this summer it will be 11 years ago that the first Expendables movie came out, which is really wild to think. But, you know, that particular movie was such an amazing moment. I mean, to anyone who's listening to this who is not a fan of you know, the classic 80s and 90s action movies like Out for Justice and Showdown in Little Tokyo, Lethal Weapon, for crying out loud. I mean, the entire idea and concept and gimmick of the Expendables, you know, all these action guys coming together for one movie, that was just such a momentous idea, event, whatever you want to call it. And with this particular podcast, I mean, I wanted to do something pretty special looking at the film. And so this is part 2, obviously, but part 1, I did the roundtable discussion with the boys over at the Sylvester Stallone Fan Podcast Network, where we just looked at the film, and it was just our general reaction. But then I wanted to take a couple segments looking at the film, first of all, its hype and its pre-production, as well as the aftermath of the film. Okay, its effect on the action genre, especially the direct-to-video market. And I figured, you know, last time I had you on, Matt, which was hard to believe, it's been over almost a year, I want to say. But I figured you would be the perfect one to have this conversation with.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and yeah, I think, thinking about like that time, you know, 11 years ago when we were, you know, like, oh, this Expendables movie it's actually happening, right? It's not just a concept or a dream. It's actually happening. Yeah, kind of the way the ripple effects that it had after the you know, on the DTV market, I think it's definitely a conversation worth having for sure.
Oh, definitely. And before we get into it and start having that conversation, I have to ask, okay, so The Expendables was released in August of 2010. You know, I have to ask you, I mean, being the huge fan of direct-to-video cinema that you are, especially the action genre, I mean, let's face it, were you as stoked as I was for the release of this particular film? Can you remember when you saw it, and what were your reactions then?
Yeah, so I didn't see it in the theater. Right? At that time, I think at that time the last movie I'd seen in the theater was Evil Dead 2. It was just like showing it like some local thing, and I just was never going to the movie theater enough at that time. So I did see it after the fact. So I actually, or maybe I did see it in the theater. Now I can't remember. I don't think I did though. I think it was something that I got on Netflix like the moment it came out on DVD. It was like, you know, one of those deals where I had to wait for my turn to get it. But it was one of those ones where it was like, I think there was a sense of like it can't be as good as I think it's going to be, if you know what I mean. Like, mm-hmm. I think in the 2000s, I think we've talked about this before, like especially like Dolph's movies in the 2000s. But I think direct to video in the 2000s was not a great. It wasn't, you know, there wasn't a lot of great stuff out there at that time, and there's some you could pick a few here or there. But the idea that a movie could be as good as something from the 80s and 90s. It just felt like there's no way they're going to deliver that. There's no way they're going to give us that. And the fact that it happened, you know, it was even the fact that it exceeded my expectations I think was what was most amazing to me.
Well, I mean, you know, and I've said this before, so I'm going to slightly repeat myself. But, you know, The Expendables was a true turning point in the action genre. And, you know, it's interesting because doing this particular podcast, we're looking at the career of Dolph Lundgren, and we are looking at his trajectory and the decisions that he was making over his entire career, for that matter, okay, with each one of those films. And going through and looking at it now in retrospect, I can look at it and I can say, oh, well, this was going on in the genre at this point, and this was going on here. So that might have affected his decisions and influenced his decisions as to why he may have taken on this role and that role, whatever it may be. But if you go back, it's and I really noticed this on my most recent viewing, which is fascinating. That's why I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you. But yeah, The Expendables, it really was a real turning point in the action genre, in that on one hand, it truly was a love letter to the action films of the 80s and the 90s, okay, the ones that you and I grew up on and the ones that we loved. However, in a lot of ways, and I really noticed this now, but it was also a swan song to the genre as well as an end. And I don't know if you've noticed this as well or not, but it's really going to be interesting talking about this with you, looking at the effect of this film and the type of films that followed. Because what's interesting is watching it, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, the money is on the screen. We'll just say that. The explosions galore. I mean, it is everything that I think a fan of these type of movies would have wanted. However, having said that, you really can't pick out too many films that have followed that particular style since. It almost feels like the genre took a bit of a nosedive after this film.
Yeah, I think you can say that for sure. I think one of the things that coincides with this film, actually, that, you know, at the time, I don't think we considered it as something that was a trend that was going to happen in movies. But you've got the Marvel Cinematic Universe kicking off.
Mm-hmm.
I think in 2009, right? Was 2009 Iron Man? So it was like right around the same.
Yeah.
2008, yeah. So it's like, and nobody really knew that was going to be the phenomenon that it was. That it's sort of essentially it changed the whole movie theater industry in a sense. That it was like everything's got to be this big as a Marvel movie, and so suddenly, like, you see the Fast and the Furious, which was a genre that started as essentially a remake of Point Break, right? The very first film, to now these movies where, you know, The Rock is like hanging off of like a rig or some kind of big truck that's hanging off of a helicopter that, you know, like they going off of a cliff somewhere or something, because of the Marvel effect, right? That everything has to be Marvel movies. And I think, you know, The Expendables is just a straight ahead actioner. I mean, even when you look at the Die Hard sequels that came out post this, you know, some of the effects were really cool. I mean, I like seeing John McClane when he took a police car and shot it off a ramp and hit a helicopter with it. I mean, I like some of those things, but it's almost like The Expendables, like you said, it almost is kind of a swan song too, because you look at it and it's almost like maybe Stallone and them could see what was happening, like that, you know, this kind of movie, this Marvel movie, this huge blockbuster kind of thing. I mean, Avatar's another one I think that's come kind of around this time as well. And there's a sense that, like, you can't just make a Stallone movie anymore. You can't just make a Dolph movie or anybody like that. I think there was a sense that they were going to have to do something different. And so I think the swan song, you know, the fact that it felt like something like a love, like you said, like a love letter, but also a swan song. I think we didn't quite realize it at the time. I think we thought this was like bringing it back. I think that we thought that Expendables was bringing back what we loved, and suddenly the straight ahead 80s. It's almost like as if you know, somebody had said, okay, hair metal's back, right? You know, like and suddenly, like, you know, we're going to start listening to Poison and all these groups again, and, you know, Def Leppard, they're going to put out new albums and they're going to be on the top of the charts and everything. And it's really like, no, it was more just a reunion tour, and we got it for a short period.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. Yeah. I mean, and obviously, okay, granted, a couple sequels to The Expendables did follow. We had Expendables 2, which came out. I mean, what's interesting is they all came out about 2 years apart. You had Expendables 2, which came out in August of 2012, and then Expendables 3, which was August of 2014. So granted, we did have some sequels that followed, but let's be honest too here, Matt. These films would not have gone theatrical had it not been for the ensemble cast that was assembled. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, but if you look at Expendables, the main story of the film, I mean, obviously it's a men on a mission movie who are going to an island to liberate the island. Okay. But in the end, the story that is at the crux of this film is, hey, all these action guys are together in one movie. And, to me, okay, look, I grew up with these guys. So to me, that was such an amazing concept and gimmick that I couldn't have cared less what the story was. I just wanted to see Dolph Lundgren back on the big screen, sharing screen time with Jet Li, Jason Statham, Sylvester Stallone. That's what got me to the theaters. But if you look at it now, again, in retrospect, 10 years later, it's fascinating because in a lot of ways, the Expendables was the beginning of the end for these action guys. And their careers, what was left of them, were essentially limited within the world of direct-to-video. Now, you look at a guy like, say, for example, Dolph Lundgren. Okay, he had already been in the direct-to-video world, obviously. I mean, you're looking at previous episodes of this show. So this, if anything, gave him a bit of a boost again. It put him back on the big screen. But if you look at all of these guys, and I kind of handpicked for our conversation, looking at each one of the action guys in this movie and kind of looking at their career path post Expendables. But I think in the end, if you look at it, yeah, they had the Expendables, and yeah, Stallone has had a couple hits since then. But in the end, like I said, it's all been. And I should probably back up. Maybe it's unfair to say that it took a downward turn. But if you look at all of these guys since the Expendables, I would say with a couple, like a very few couple films, but for the most part, none of them have matched the excitement and just the awesomeness that this film had.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mitch Level is the video vacuum. He was on. We were talking about the Dolph film Altitude, and he kind of talks. He terms it a Dolphissance instead of a Renaissance. A Dolphissance kind of posed this film, and it does feel like out of all of them, Dolph was the one who sort of carved out a niche after and doing. He wasn't a lead guy in big screen films, but he did get parts. I mean, he got a part in Aquaman. I mean, he made the Creed film with Creed 2 with Stallone, which I think, for me, I feel like Dolph's role in that was huge. I think, he really brought something to that part. And I think out of everybody, I think he was the one who, because he was DTV before, I think the fact that he was getting any kind of Hollywood attention after, he was good with it. Whereas like Stallone, I think Stallone looked at the Expendables as, this is my vehicle to get me back in the leading roles. And that never happened for him. And I think part of the reason why it didn't happen for him is if you watch the movies, it's like Dolph steals the show in the first one. So then he gives Dolph kind of a smaller, kind of goofier, wackier part in the second film where he's just kind of driving around with his big guns and his big trucks and shooting things and like yelling. So, he gives him a kind of a smaller role, but then Van Damme comes in and steals it, right? Now Van Damme's like, completely stealing the show. And I think same thing as Dolph. I think Van Damme, even though Van Damme had the big screen success that Dolph never quite had, I think Van Damme was also okay with it after that. He was kind of doing his own parts, and he was, he didn't need the big screen fare necessarily either that Stallone, I think, was searching for. And then I think in part 3, I mean, I hate to say, because Mel Gibson, because I'm not a fan of Mel Gibson, especially, and I don't really cover his stuff, but he kind of also, Stallone's mindset with the third one was, okay, all of these guys are stealing the show from me, so I'm going to mothball them for the entire film and bring in like Kellen Lutz and Ronda Rousey, and there's no way, and Mel Gibson was saying all this anti-Semitic stuff, there's no way he's going to steal the movie for me. Well, Mel Gibson kind of does, which I think is kind of a, I know for me, I'm not, like I said, I'm not a fan of Mel Gibson, but I think at the very least, it didn't do for Stallone what Stallone was hoping these would do for him, because, he had everybody in them. And then I think everybody looked at it as like, this is my shot. This is, Gary Daniels is like, this is my shot to show who I am. Jason Statham's like, yeah, I'm starting to get less, roles. I want to show what I can do. Scott Adkins in the second one showing what he can do. And so I think you're right. I think because everybody was in there and everybody was trying to get their piece of the spotlight for this small thing. It's almost like another analogy is a group New Edition when they toured in the 90s after, in the late 90s. It's like, okay, Bobby Brown has been a solo act for all this time. Johnny Gill's been a solo act for all this time. Belle Biv DeVoe's been their own thing. Ralph Tresvant. Suddenly they're having to share the stage together, and they're like, I don't want to do this, or like you could also say like, Sammy Hagar and David Lee Roth when they were touring together, and they would have to take turns headlining, right? Because neither of them wanted to let the other one be the headliner. I think that's what you saw with these movies, is that everybody they were so larger than life that to fit them all on the screen together at once, it diminished people like Stallone. He didn't show up. He didn't come off as well as some of the other ones, I think.
Well, yeah, I agree with you completely. And if it's okay, I mean, because I feel like, I mean, you said it already, and so I'll echo it. I think Dolph, post Expendables, has had the most fascinating career turn, if you will. So I'd like to save him for the end because, like I said, I think he's had the most fascinating. But if we look at Sylvester Stallone, okay, he was the ringleader to this entire concept, to this entire idea, okay? And Stallone, if you can go back this far, Stallone had already been having a bit of a career comeback in a sense because he, did Rocky Balboa, which came out in 2006, I want to say, and then Rambo, the new Rambo movie, that came out in 2008. So he was slowly kind of, coming back into the public consciousness again and becoming relevant once again. And then, thanks to the Expendables, he had come back and then some. I mean, it was established by that point, okay, hey, Stallone is back. And if you think about it, around the early to mid 2000s, yeah, Stallone was, he had a few movies that went direct to video as well. Okay. And so for him to be back on the big screen, that was pretty, that was pretty magical and pretty cool to see as well. But what's interesting, and again, I'm noticing this now, okay, but what's interesting is, yeah, he has had success since the Expendables, but if you really notice it, he's really reliant on his franchise characters, Rocky and Rambo, to continue putting his face on the big screen and reminding people that he is still, out there. Okay. 2015, we saw the return of Rocky and Creed, and then a couple years ago, thanks to Creed 2. But if you think about it, back in, I want to say it was 2000, what was it? It was 2013 or so. He did the film Bullet to the Head. Okay, which, and I don't know if you saw that, if you remember it, but yeah, Bullet to the Head came out, directed by Walter Hill. I loved it. I mean, I'll just say that right now. I think Bullet to the Head is a fun movie, but it did terrible at the box office. It barely even cracked the top 10. Okay, and I think that right there, because we're going to be going to Arnold Schwarzenegger here in a minute. He also kind of tried his hand at this, but I think the fact that a film like Bullet to the Head, which also was a love letter that was hearkening back to these type of films from the 80s and the 90s, the fact that film did as terrible as it did, and it tanked at the box office, because that film, if you think about it, it didn't have all the other action guys, for Stallone to team up with. It was just solely a Stallone vehicle. And so for that film to tank like it did, I think that right there was a true testimony and indicator to the fact that, okay, let's be honest, these type of action movies were over. They were dead. And if you look at Stallone, okay, again, I don't want to mitigate his talents and his success on the big screen, okay? Because again, this past year we had the return of Rambo and everything like that. But if you look at outside of those franchise characters, okay, he did sequels to Escape Plan, okay? Escape Plan 2 and 3 were released direct to video. They were awful, okay? He did this dopey looking film. I haven't even seen it, called Backtrace. Okay. Mm-hmm. And Backtrace just looked, I've read the reviews, I've seen the trailer. I don't need to see it. It looks absolutely abysmal. And so you look at that and it's like, okay, if Stallone isn't commanding the box office, I think it's an indicator that it's on its way out, if it hasn't already been over.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at just as we're talking about it timeline wise, right? Where 2013, 2014, now we're getting full on Marvel at this point. The only franchises that are really managing to stick with Marvel at that point are like the Fast and the Furious ones, and then I guess it's like Paranormal Activity or some of those horror ones. I think but really it was. So at that point you can see like there's the Taken sequels, right? That they were kind of using Liam Neeson at that time. I think Taken was 2008, so I guess it was into the early 2010s. You had these other sequels with Liam Neeson. They were kind of just trying to get as much blood out of that stone, I think, as they could. But I remember there was an action film with Taraji P. Henderson that I can't remember the name of that one, but that was, I think they were trying to see if we can have a female in the lead, and maybe harken back to maybe some 70s blaxploitation elements. That might do the trick. But I think you're right. At this stage of the game, you can't, unless it's like a big Marvel movie. And I mean, you look at the Fast and the Furious movies. I mean, they're essentially Expendables movies, right? It's, how many big stars
they're so
can we
watered down.
I mean, that's
Right,
the thing.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
and everyone seems to bring that up as well. Yeah, but that's the argument that I've heard. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's the argument that I always hear is that, the action movie as we know it is still very much alive. Look at the Fast and the Furious franchise. That always gets thrown out there, but it's like, those aren't the same. Like, you know what I mean? Like, those aren't.
Right. I mean, I think the thing that they borrow from the Expendables, though, and I think that you could say the same thing about the Marvel movies, you could say it about the DC movies that are coming out now, is that big ensemble cast of action heroes. That, it's like, because remember, you think about like the Marvel movies or the comic book movies before Iron Man, and actually kind of Iron Man is where they're starting to kind of get the sense of it, like, let's bring these heroes together. It was always like the one hero. So it's always Spider-Man, and then Spider-Man fights Dr. Octopus, or he fights the lizard or whatever. But it's just Spider-Man. It's only by himself. And, when we read comics, at least I know for me, when I read comics growing up, no, they teamed up. They hung out together. Spider-Man and Daredevil would go, beat somebody up, or the Punisher would show up or something like that. And so with the Expendables, we get that, right? I mean, when you think about it, right? I mean, what's the closest that we've ever had to something like the Expendables, where you've got like at least like two big names? I mean, like Tango and Cash or something. It's like, you're lucky if you get two in a movie, let alone, I mean, Heat, right? Heat had three, right? I guess it had Val Kilmer, De Niro, Pacino, but those aren't really action guys either, right? I mean, and part of it is because of the egos, right? These guys, it's like they want to lead the film. But now what you see is like every movie, we're talking about Fast and the Furious. You're right. They're not action movies the way that Expendables is an action movie. They're not that kind of 80s, 90s action film that we grew up with. These Fast and the Furious movies are something completely different, but they do like to use that idea. And I've read that Vin Diesel's like a really big Dungeons and Dragons fan, so he likes the idea of like the quest and adding people to your quest as you go. So that's why, like, Jason Statham's a baddie in one of them, then he becomes a part of the team. That kind of thing. But it is the same idea in the sense of like, we need a lot of star power if we're going to get people to the theater. Like, you can't just do the movie with just Vin Diesel anymore. Vin Diesel's not enough to carry a movie. The Rock, I don't know what's happened with some of The Rock's solo action pictures, but it feels like, no, he's got to do it with Jason Statham and Idris Elba. It's like, I think that was maybe one of the turning points, is that, in all the Marvel movies, they always have like 3 or 4 people in them nowadays. Even I think Black Panther, I can't remember, it had a few different, but even that's like, they kind of build a team of people. I think that might have been one of the things that Hollywood looked at. Like, why just get one person? We need a whole bunch of stars in the movie.
Well, and even if you look at a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger, okay, and Sylvester Stallone, these were the two biggest guys. I mean, if you think about it, these were the two biggest movie stars on the planet, and their name alone could open a movie. I mean, and that's wild to think that we lived in a time where, just that name could open a movie. But there was a period where that happened. And so if you look at a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger, okay, he did the film, he did his little cameo in the Expendables 1, and then he came back for, longer parts, you can say, in Expendables 2 and 3. But if you look at it, once he left being governor of California and he tried his hand back at the movies, okay, his big theatrical comeback where he was in a lead role was The Last Stand. And coincidentally, that actually came out about a month actually before Stallone had the film Bullet to the Head that came out. Okay. And it was just really wild to see. And look, I saw these movies opening night, okay, opening weekend, okay. I enjoyed Last Stand. I did. Okay. But if you look at it, it floundered horribly, okay, similar to Bullet to the Head. I think same thing with Last Stand. It barely cracked the top 10. It was out of theaters within a couple weeks. And so what did Schwarzenegger do? Well, he had another film that came out about a year later. He did Sabotage. I don't know if you saw that one or not, but that one is a very just dark and nihilistic action movie. Same thing, though. That one tanked at the box office. So what is a guy like Schwarzenegger, who was once, at one time, the biggest movie star in the world, okay, his movies aren't delivering at the box office anymore. What does he do? Well, he follows the route of a lot of his compatriots, and he goes direct to video. And so we saw Schwarzenegger try his hand at some drama. Okay, he did these little small direct-to-video films like Maggie and Aftermath, okay, which are decent films, okay, don't get me wrong, and it's there's something really kind of cool about seeing a guy like Arnold, this big, muscular Austrian dude, trying these small little dramas, okay? However, and we've said this on the show as well before. I'm sure you can agree with it. But in the end, a direct-to-video film just does not have the same polish as something that is intended to go theatrical. And and once that's decided, I think from the get-go in a production that this film is independent, is going to be going on a what is it they call it, a premium video on demand route. Okay, all right. Even with Arnold headlining, it just doesn't have that same feel. And again, going back to what I said with Bullet to the Head. Okay, the fact that Stallone is headlining a film like Bullet to the Head. Okay, Schwarzenegger is headlining a film like Last Stand, whatever. They come out within a month of each other, and these films barely even crack the top 10. That right there is just a clear indicator and testimony that, you know what, these guys, I mean, they're still acting, God bless them, but audiences apparently nowadays want something different in terms of their action heroes. And what's interesting about Schwarzenegger is at this point, he again kind of pulled a cue from Stallone. He figured, well, let's go back to the franchise then. And so what did we see Arnold do? But he went back to the Terminator, and he did 2 Terminator films. And even the 2 Terminator films, and we can pick apart the Terminator films. They have problems, but still, you know what I mean? It's really kind of a shame. I mean, look, all things must pass. All things grow. I get that. But it's really fascinating, and it's really interesting to see that, these guys, I mean, they're old, they're getting old, and these films are, they're on their way out if they're not already.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned about the franchise part of it, because that seems to be the big thing. And I think that was even a big thing before, when the Expendables, before the Expendables came out, that Hollywood was looking for franchises. I mean, it's like, Robert Downey Jr. is playing Sherlock Holmes because they wanted to create a Sherlock Holmes franchise. It's like, they reboot Charlie's Angels with a new cast because they want to create a Charlie's Angels franchise. And it's like, Disney seems to have the big ones locked up, right? They've got Star Wars, they've got their own Disney movies, and they've got Marvel, and they've got Pixar, right? So it's like they've got the biggest ones, and then Universal, I guess, or Warner has DC, but DC, it's like that's just one compared to 4 or 5, and I think everyone was looking for their franchises, and so when Schwarzenegger's looking for something, they're like, yeah, if we can get Terminator off the ground, that's a franchise. We can maybe pull in 800 million in the box office worldwide, or get something that grosses in the top 10 for the year. That's like everybody's trying to get that in. Because I think one of the things that's interesting, going back to Fast and the Furious, I think what's unique about Fast and the Furious is that it is the kind of the outlier of a franchise, right? It's not based on some really established concept that the other ones are, yet it still kind of makes that kind of money. And I think people think like, okay, Fast and the Furious can do it. We can do it with Terminator. We can do it with Rambo. We can do it with those ones. And I think you're right that I think, like you said, we can pick apart those Terminator ones, and sometimes that's what it is too. But I think it's like, man, if you can't get the buzz behind it, and there are other factors we could talk about too, like the fact that Disney, because they have these big franchises, they completely overrun theaters. And so with the way theaters work, I mean, when we were growing up, something like Batman in 1989 or whatever, 88 or whenever that came out, that had like 2 theaters, I think it had, in a movie theater. Nowadays, that Batman would take up 4 theaters, or, Disney would try to get it so that Marvel movie, and Disney they can kind of take over an entire theater with all of their franchises at once if they want to. And so then, that Terminator movie only gets 1 or 2 screens at a theater. Well, now it's only getting 1 or 2 screens. People have already spent all of this money to go see the Marvel movie. You're going to shell out another $50 to go see another theater, because the theaters are so expensive nowadays. So it's really hard in this current ecosystem to carve out a theatrical career nowadays, because of the way like Disney has completely sort of taken it over. And I think that's one of the things too. I think we're seeing is that, so if you don't have kind of like a big tent approach. I mean, you like you talk about, Schwarzenegger was one of the biggest names in the 80s. Stallone was one of the biggest names in the 80s, but they weren't really like big tent kind of films, right? They were kind of like, guys go out and watch this thing and get a kick out of it and love it. And then like women might, I'm not trying to cast, because there were plenty of women that went to see Stallone films too, but there was an idea that like, you had your movies for men, movies for women, movies for kids, and they all could grow and breathe in this ecosystem. You could have comedies and dramas and actions, and all of them could breathe in the ecosystem, and all of them could make money. And I think you take 10 years away from Stallone and Schwarzenegger, they come back into this new ecosystem that is just, there's not enough air for them. And now we saw the unfortunate reality that it's direct to video. And like you said, direct to video, because it doesn't pull in that kind of money. When you've had Ben Sachs on as a producer, I think one of my favorite things that he talked about in sort of the direct to video world is like, the studio comes to him and says, how much can you make this movie for? I can make it for $5 million. Great. Make it for $3 million. It's like, that's kind of what they're living with there. And for someone like Stallone or Schwarzenegger to have to live in that kind of ecosystem, I can imagine was probably very disheartening.
Right. Well, I mean, look, we keep mentioning the Fast and the Furious. Okay. And so that's an excellent segue, because if you look at a guy like Jason Statham, okay. Yeah. So when the Expendables came out, Jason Statham was, I mean, I would say he was like the leading action guy. Okay. Like he was the guy who was still getting, those action type roles that the guys like Stallone and Schwarzenegger and Dolph were getting back in the 80s and 90s. Okay. That was all in the shoes of Jason Statham. So it only made sense, okay, that Sylvester Stallone was going to cast Jason Statham for this movie. And can we say, okay, Jason Statham, he had an amazing run doing action movies. Okay, if you take a look at his run, I would say it was from about 2002, 2003 to about 2012. He was doing nothing but straight up action movies, and he had some. I mean, let's face it, he had some awesome ones. Okay, some went direct to video, but I'd say a good majority did go theatrical. I mean, if you take a look at The Mechanic. Okay, The Mechanic is a really cool one. Safe is a really cool one. The Crank movies are completely trashy and ridiculous, but you love them as well. But if you think about it, I think Jason Statham, both him and you can also say his agent as well, they also saw the writing on the wall here. Okay. And they also saw that, look, these films were drying up and maybe a lot of them weren't coming his way anymore. And so thankfully, he found he maybe not an easy route, but he found success going the franchise route, we can say. And so he latched onto Fast and the Furious franchise. And I think, he did this to kind of continue being relevant and, continue having some career longevity. And then we also saw him starting to do some more commercial stuff. Okay. So he did the film The Meg, which is, that ridiculous giant shark movie. Okay, he did that. I guess he has another film that is currently in post right now called, actually I don't even know what it's called, but it's directed by Guy Ritchie. So I guess he's kind of going back to his roots. But for the most part, I think, like I said, Statham saw the writing on the wall, and I think that explains his most recent career decisions as well.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? He comes into Fast and the Furious 7, and I remember he tweeted it, like, because when that was like the announcement, he was like, something like Toretto, let's go, or something like that. And I think it was, it's one of those things too, where I think when you watch those Fast and the Furious movies, where it's like, I think they do something with movies that I think we didn't see in the 80s, right? Where it's like, okay, because they're looking to have these huge franchises that go on forever. So it's like, we would watch a movie in the 80s and you'd have a bad guy. You've got, whoever, Vernon Wells in Commando, or I can't think of his name, the bad guy in Cobra, that actor, big beefy.
Oh, Brian
actor.
Thompson.
Brian Johnson, right? Chow Khan. They're in the movie. They're the bad guy. They get killed, right? Hans Gruber gets killed at the end. But with these franchises, it's like, no. We've got Jason Statham in this movie, and he's the bad guy, but we need him for the next ones, right? Because everybody likes him. It's like The Rock is the bad guy, but we need him because everybody likes The Rock. And then, I think what happened for Vin Diesel, right, is that they kind of took the franchise over from him, and that's why I think they had to split off the Hobbs and Shaw movie, because I think the two of them were like, we want to do something different with this versus what Vin Diesel wanted to do with it. And it's like, too many big names in the room, I think. But it's so different from what we were used to, right? Where it's like, no, if we got 3 Rambo movies, they're going to have different baddies in them. Or if we bring back a baddie, it's not because he's a good guy now and he's hanging out with Rambo. They brought him back and he's usually got like kind of a scar on his face, and he, it's like he survived some kind of, some exploding helicopter debacle, and somehow he came back to fight Stallone again. It's a very different thing, I think. And who knows, maybe there's something about it too. Like maybe it appeals to younger viewers. Whereas, for people our age, we just want to see the baddie get vanquished. We don't want to, see him get turned into a good guy in the next movie. We don't really care about that. I don't know what that is, but with Statham, you're right. Statham like figured it out. Like he's like, I'm going to steal the show in Fast and the Furious 7. They can't not bring me back for Fast and the Furious 8 because I'm going to be so good in Fast and the Furious 7. And it's like a very different thing, I think, from what we're used to.
Well, I mean, speaking of bad guys, I mean, let's look at Steve Austin. I don't know if we need to refer to him as Steve Austin or Stone Cold Steve Austin. I think Stone Cold that's obviously trademarked by the WWE. But Steve Austin, he had a short run. I mean, I think thanks to the Expendables, he prospered a little bit. It was a short period, but he did prosper in the world of direct-to-video, okay? Because unfortunately, unless he is, I mean, it's really unfortunate because actually I like Steve Austin. I think he's, he only really has one mode, I guess, that he plays. But I mean, I think he's great when he's on screen. Before he did Expendables, where he shows up as Eric Roberts' right-hand man, he did The Condemned, which I actually enjoy. I think that's a fun movie. Oddly enough, that one actually went theatrical. But after The Expendables, he had a very short-lived career as a leading action guy. And again, all of these films went direct to video. It's interesting because thanks to The Expendables, it seems like he developed a partnership with a producer by the name of Julius Nasso. Okay, and so most of the films that we saw Steve Austin do following The Expendables were produced by Nasso. So you have the film Damage, Hunt to Kill, The Stranger. He also did another film called Maximum Conviction, interestingly, where he's partnered with Steven Seagal, only he and Steven Seagal really don't share any scenes together. But even that, I mean, and that's a, look, I don't want to mitigate that at all. I mean, because that's a pretty good run for a guy like Steve Austin. However, though, again, writing on the wall, that didn't last very long. And last I checked, I think Steve Austin is now doing like reality TV, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So one of the last ones he did was a movie called Chain of Command, which, okay. I don't know because there's a lot of Chain of Commands out there, but I watched this movie because it's also got Michael Jai White in it, and when you watch it, you realize something went horribly wrong with the making of it. I don't know what it was, but it was directed by a person who made I think the movie is called Seven. I'm trying to think what it was called. The director's name was Kevin Carraway. He also wrote it, but he did a movie called Seven Below that had Val Kilmer and Ving Rhames in it, and so I think, and that movie was pretty competently made, Seven Below, and I think, whatever happened, they were going to make this movie, and whether the funding got pulled on it or something went wrong, but it looks like a very low budget indie film. There's scenes that you're watching where you're seeing people fall into falling off buildings and landing on padded things, or you're seeing like one scene where somebody is like tied to a chair or something, the next scene they're not, but then they are again the next, like those kinds of things that just tells you that something went wrong, that it wasn't like, they had to use footage they didn't want to use kind of thing. And that was the last one that Stone Cold, that Steve Austin did. And he was actually pretty good in it. It's just, the movie itself just didn't work. And I don't think he's done anything since then. I don't know, but I think that was one that was probably not. It hurt both his and I think for Michael Jai White, I think it hurt him as well. It just didn't come out like they wanted it to. I mean, one of the things I noticed with Steve Austin's career is that
it's so hard. You want to call him Stone Cold?
I know. Well, because the thing is, like, that Stone Cold character was so electric. I mean, because that one, when you think about like Game Changers, I mean, when we were growing up with wrestling, you had good guys and you had bad guys, and there was no in between. But here comes Steve Austin as the bad guy, like beating up Bret the Hitman Hart, and people were cheering for it. They loved it. And suddenly it was like, oh, you can actually do this. You can like drink beer and throw the cans at guys and still be likable. And when I watch his movies, his DTV movies, I don't see enough of that stone cold character. It's almost like he doesn't have as much. There's not that as much of that natural charisma that I love with the wrestling. His characters tend to be like these dark, brooding types of guys. And I think that was kind of a missed opportunity with him. I feel like that, you could have had like a Dolph-ish kind of, because you think of Dolph's charisma when he plays his parts, that like there's something fun about him doing movies that, I think maybe Stone Cold, maybe he didn't want to be Stone Cold anymore. Maybe he was like, I don't want to be Stone Cold. I want to be something else in the movies, which is fine. But when you've got natural charisma like that, I always feel like you got to use it. And I do feel like in the Expendables film, there was a little bit more of that he, Eric Roberts was the main baddie. So he was playing that hatchet man role that generally doesn't have a lot of personality. But it was definitely, if I was going to pick someone to play that role, he would have been the one to do it. So I definitely appreciated that.
Well, and okay, let's look at the man of the hour here. Okay, Dolph Lundgren. All right. Again, he, in my opinion, and obviously maybe I'm a little biased, but I would say out of all of these guys, okay, Dolph has had post Expendables the most interesting and fascinating trajectory in terms of his films that followed. I've seen it on various message boards. I will say the Expendables for Dolph was a blessing in so many ways, but I will also say it was a little bit of a curse. And I feel in some ways it almost kind of overexposed him a bit too much. So here's a statistic, okay, that I pulled up today that I don't know about you, Matt, but I found this fascinating. If you look at Dolph, okay, from 1985 to 2010. Okay, so we're basically looking at Rocky IV to the Expendables. Okay, Dolph did approximately 39 different projects. Okay, so 39 different films of various capacities, whether they're supporting roles or, leading roles, however you want to refer to it. Okay, but he was in about 39 projects, okay, in those 25 years from 1985 to 2010. Okay, now, if you look at 2010 to today, to the present. Okay, so we're looking at Expendables to now. Dolph has done 40 different projects. 40. All right, so in 25 years, he did the same amount of films that he has done within the past 10 years. Okay, and so like I said, it's a bit of on one hand, Expendables opened a ton of doors for the guy. But on the other hand, I think, again, that is another testament, okay, to the ever-changing genre, okay, because nowadays these films, okay, these independent direct-to-video films, they simply do not have the budgets that they used to. They do not have the shooting time that they used to, and so as a result, you have a guy like Dolph, who is, I don't want to say he's working for paychecks here, but he's also essentially trying to strike while the iron's hot and make a living. Okay, so if you look at the films that he was doing from the 90s to the early 2000s, okay, he was roughly working on about maybe 1 to 2 films a year. And those films that he was doing around that period, we can say The Peacekeeper and Sweepers, okay, those particular films, those had fairly hefty budgets for being a direct-to-video film, okay? Those had budgets for between 10 to 12 million. Nowadays, okay, you look at a lot of films he's been doing within the past 6 years or whatever, we're talking budgets of barely 3 million. I mean, there is just not much of a market there anymore for these particular films. And so I don't know if you've noticed any of that or picked up on that particular output. I mean, that's an impressive output. I mean, 40 films and TV shows and everything that he has done over the course of 11 years. But man, if you look at them, okay, the quality of these projects compared to what he had been doing in 25 years from 85 to 2010, it's a stark difference, man.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you there. I mean, there's some interesting things that come up, right? Because I think the world almost rediscovers Dolph, right? Like we knew Dolph. I mean, I think a big reason why we went to the Expendables was because it had Dolph. We were Dolph fans before the movie came out, but there were a lot of people who didn't really know Dolph, right? There were a lot of people that had kind of forgotten about him. They knew, Masters of the Universe. They knew Ivan Drago, I Must Break You and all of that stuff. They knew that kind of thing, but they had kind of like, oh, who is this? And it's like once the Expendables comes out, I mean, he's doing commercials a lot at that point. I think there was like insurance companies and like there was a lawnmower company that was using. I mean, everybody wanted him. He was on TV shows all over the place. I mean, he was doing Arrow. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Just tons of stuff. And I think you're right about the movies. I think with the movies, it's like, I mean, he was doing a lot of small parts in things, but you're right. Like you can kind of see, like, I think in 2016, I'm looking at it here. I see 5 movies that he did. Now one of them was an uncredited part in Hail Caesar, the Coen brothers film. So it's interesting how he's getting like, bit parts and or like, uncredited parts and, Coen brothers, Oscar winning directors that are like, big deals. At the same time, he's doing another Kindergarten Cop film. He's doing, a Russian film that I have now come close to seeing, Melchiznik. I don't know how you even, I've seen it listed there, but I don't know how you even find that. Yeah, you're right. He's kind of working paycheck to paycheck, but at the same time, he's getting these roles, we're going to use him in Aquaman. So it's almost like full circle, right? Where he was in Punisher that was like left on the shelf and didn't really get its due. Now he gets to be in a big comic book movie in Aquaman and have a sizable part in that. It's in, like you said, I agree with you. It's like, on the one hand, it's so great to see him in so many things. It's great to see him in like a, what was it, HBO film, Tour de Pharmacy, where he's like,
right.
He's playing like it's like, I think John Cena is playing him as the young character in the 70s and then he's playing the older version of that character. But he's doing the all kinds of different stuff. And you're right. It's interesting. It's like he's overexposed to some extent because you're seeing a lot of movies here that just didn't work for whatever reason. And then you're seeing, you don't see like those, there's no like Showdown of Little Tokyos in here. There's nothing that you can look at and say like, man, this one, I mean, I don't know if I have any of these movies, these new ones, in my like top 20 Dolph films.
No.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I never really considered. I think Altitude is the one that I had kind of like the highest because I really like the way he played in that film. And I also like the way that they used Denise Richard as the hero, and he kind of took a back seat as the bad guy to let her be the hero and lead the film, but yet he was still Dolph. There was that one I liked, and then Don't Kill It and Welcome to Willits. I think Welcome to Willits, he had such a small part in that one too because he was just like kind of like a TV personality. But yeah, you're right. I don't see anything that's like, if I'm ranking my, whatever, how many movies Dolph is on, 60, 70, whatever it is, none of these are in the top 20. I agree with you there.
Well, I mean, and look, let's face it. I mean, thanks to the Expendables, Dolph finally got mainstream attention and heat once again. I mean, considering he had, been relegated to, that direct-to-video era, okay, or area, however you want to refer to it, it was really cool to see him finally, getting all this attention again. And so, on one hand, look, I get it, okay? He's striking while the iron is hot. Okay, and he is signing up for all of these various projects that are coming his way. I mean, I remember, it was wild actually, but I remember after Expendables, okay, once that, it had been out of theaters, but he was in the public consciousness, it was announced that he had signed up for 3 different projects, okay? He had one in the chamber, the package, and Stash House. Okay, I mean, It was pretty much I don't even know if it was a 3-picture deals. I don't think they were all done by the producers, but I mean, it was announced at one specific time that he, had latched on to 3 different projects. So look, I get it. Okay. He's striking while the iron is hot. Okay. And so he's, his name is out there. He's going to, continue doing his best at selling himself. There was also some other stuff that was going on that's probably important to mention. Dolph had moved back to Los Angeles. He had gotten divorced. And so he had moved back to Los Angeles. And, okay, let's face it, Los Angeles, that's the epicenter for a lot of these productions. And so I think that kind of factored in as well. The fact that, okay, now that he's in Los Angeles, well, it makes it easier for him to accept some of these projects and show up on set for, anywhere from 5 days to, a week, as opposed to prior to the Expendables, he was living in Europe, like I said. And, because he was living in Europe, he was only able to make 1, maybe 2 direct-to-video films a year. So I think that kind of factors in. But again, going back to what I said earlier, you know, you look at those films, okay, from the I'd say from the entire 90s period, okay, even something like Bridge of Dragons, for example, which is completely ridiculous, okay, I don't know if you're familiar with that one or if you've seen it, completely ridiculous, but you look at something like that, okay, you know, it has a little more money going, you know, towards it, you can see, I mean, that's on the screen. And look, I mean, and I imagine you're seeing this as well, looking at a lot of the films. I mean, you mentioned it already, talking about Chain of Command. Okay, you look at these films nowadays, these budgets are so small to almost non-existent. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if most of the budget that is there is going toward the stars' salaries. Okay, and so as a result, these productions, like for example, Shark Lake and Blood of Redemption, these are some of the gems that Dolph has done within the past, you know, few years. These productions, they can only afford guys like Dolph for only a few days. Right. So you have the director, okay, who's already, you know, making the film with scraps as is. Okay, he's trying to wrangle all of these various obstacles. Okay, and then he has a lead that they can only afford for 3-4 days. Well, then what do? How are you supposed to film a 95-minute movie when your lead is only going to be on set for a few days, you know?
Yeah, I mean, just look at 2019, because you can really get three different approaches to handling only having Dolph for a few days, right? You've got Hard Night Falling, where essentially we lose Dolph for 20-minute, half-hour stretches in the middle of the film. It's like Die Hard in a castle, but he's it's like if you had Die Hard with John McClane just missing for huge chunks of time. Acceleration, he spends most of the time just sitting behind a wall of TVs, you know, while why can't I think of her name? Natalie
Byrne.
Natalie Byrne is doing all the work, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world. But, you know, I think, again, you know, that's how you mitigate the Dolph situation there. And then the tracker, you know, he's kind of, there's this whole like intrigue plot going on with this Italian cop who's trying to unravel it while Dolph is going to get his revenge. So again, that's how you kind of can mitigate the lack of Dolph in the movie. So there's these creative ways that some of these directors do it, where it's, I mean, you notice like with a Bruce Willis film, it's just like, you know, there he is in one location. He's only in that one location the whole time. He doesn't move. He doesn't, you know, generally doesn't even change, you know, outfits. He's in, you know, the same suit for the whole time. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, you know, like you said, you've only got Dolph for a couple days. So what do? You figure out a way to make him a part of the film without using a lot of footage there. And you notice with all three of those movies, it's like, you feel like there's something missing when he's not on the scene. And granted, I love Natalie Byrne. I think she's really great. But there's something about when Dolph leaves the room in a film that all the air tends to come out of it. If you know he's in the movie, it's like when he's not there. And so I think I kind of see what, you know, for me, I guess it's a big part of why I don't, you know, place any of these in very like high on my Dolph list, because you know, as a Dolph fan, you can really feel that. You're just like, I'm here to watch Dolph, and it's like all I'm doing is waiting 20-minute periods to see Dolph again. And you know, I think you're right. I think, you know, when in the 90s those movies were made in Europe, and now they're made in LA because they're made in 2 days, really quickly, really cheaply. So you don't need to be in Europe to make them if you're doing it like that. It's kind of a cynical way to look at it, and you know, I think I can kind of see what you mean. I think I was coming into this conversation being like, yeah, Dolph just blows up after the Expendables, and it's like it's huge, you know, like Mitch Lovell had said on my show before, it's a Dolph-assance. But I get what you're saying here about there is a little bit of an overexposure here, that there's another side to this. There's a yin to this yang here that's not as good.
Well, and of course, I don't want to throw out or discredit films like Aquaman or Creed 2, because I mean those are huge, big budget films that went theatrical, and I also don't want to discredit. I mean, I would say the best film that Dolph has done post Expendables that went the kind of direct to video route is Skin Trade. Okay, Skin Trade, I would say, is, you know, that one goes head and shoulders above all these other films. And, you know, my buddy Chris Prentice, you know, he's been on quite a few of my episodes, but he said something that I think is so apt and so fitting about Skin Trade. If you look at the movie Skin Trade, okay, that is a film that, and I probably should have pulled up the exact budget that was used
I've
for.
got it right here. I might be able to. I've got IMDb. I always have IMDb up when I do these
Okay.
conversations. So let me see if I can pull the budget here.
Well, I do know that Skin Trade, that was a project that Dolph was heavily invested in. Okay, yeah. He spent quite a bit more time, on set. And so you look at a film like that, and it's like my buddy Chris said. I mean, you look at a film like Skin Trade, and that looks like a real movie. I mean, compared to all the other stuff, compared to, say, Altitude or Acceleration or Shark Lake or any of those, you look at Skin Trade and it's like, man, like this looks like an actual movie. This looks like something that could go theatrical, as opposed to Acceleration or Altitude. I mean, those films to me just look like cheap TV movies. I mean, the digital look doesn't do them any favors, and they just look kind of cheap. And when you hear that Dolph was on set for maybe about a week, it's like, it shows. Okay, I can tell.
Yeah, for sure. So budget on this was $9 million. So that's
okay.
That gives you a sense. And it did almost 600,000 worldwide gross just for box office, which for 2014 for a movie like this, that's not horrible. Obviously you'd like to try to make your budget back, but I guess it's they're expecting to make it back. But I think that's kind of the big thing, right? I think when you had Ben Sachs on your show, he was talking about how these movies generally don't make their budget back. That these direct-to-video movies nowadays, they often don't make the. I think even in the 90s and the 2000s, remember, we would buy these movies. We'd buy them, sometimes we buy them new for $20, and there isn't that market anymore. Now it's, well, let's wait till it's on Prime and rent it for $3. And that's if I want to spend the $3. I mean, Acceleration, it didn't take long for that one to be streamed for free on Prime. So these movies don't make their budget back anymore because, we can just, wait to stream them somewhere. And with so many things available to stream, you really got to have something that is just really, really spectacular. And I think for me, a new Dolph movie a lot of times is, actually, when I think about it, Acceleration I was able to get through Hoopla. But I think I did pay to get both Hard Night Falling and Tracker. Or no, Tracker was available on another streaming service that we were getting for free with our cable company that week. So nobody's paying for these anymore, and so you can't afford to spend $9 million on a movie like this if it's barely going to make it back on Amazon Prime streams.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be a real true turning point in the podcast, I will say, because, look, I said it, there are still so many films to cover post Expendables. But I'll be honest, many of them are of a kind of a middling quality, I will say. A buddy recommended to me maybe doing some combo episodes because a full-on discussion looking at a film like Shark Lake or Blood of Redemption would be kind of difficult or impossible to do. It might even be difficult to find guests for those. So Matt, I'll probably be hitting you up. I'll be hitting you up quite a bit for a lot of these. But look, hey, I've had a ton of fun reminiscing about this film with you and kind of looking at the market and its evolution, if you will. Before I let you go, is there anything that you want to give a shout out to or plug?
dtvconnoisseur.blogspot.com. That's the site, and you'll probably find links for everything there. Also, my novel Chad in Accounting is available on Amazon. Probably better to look up Chad in Accounting than look up my name, Matt Poirier, because it's really hard to remember how to spell my last name. So if you look up Chad in Accounting, you can get it on paperback or Kindle. But yeah, pretty much everything. If you go to dtvconnoisseur.blogspot.com, that has links to all my social media and everything like that. Right on.
Well, I had a ton of fun with you last time I was on your show. You graciously had me on, and we talked about the enigma that was Mr. Steven Seagal. That was a ton of fun to chat with you. So thank you again for that opportunity. I actually directed a buddy to that episode a few weeks ago, and he was like, "Man, you guys really give it to Seagal, but you don't say anything that's not true."
Yeah, I think you had one of the best analogies ever to describe a movie. When you described that film and you said that it's like somebody's catering a meal for a party, and they've got everything ready to go, but then they're told at the last minute that like everything has to have pineapple in it, and that kind of described that movie, Against the Dark. That's like a vampire movie that you just sort of thrust Seagal into it. He's the pineapple.
Yeah, there's no
that's,
reason
thrust into everything.
Yeah, and if you look at a lot of the films that Seagal has done actually within the past 10 years, there's no reason for Seagal to be in a lot of those movies, because what he does, kind of like what we talked about earlier, he lets like a younger guy, some kind of no-name, do all the action while he just sits the entire movie, and then yet he gets top billing. It's like, what is this?
Yes, he gets top billing, he gets the girl. I mean, interesting, we're talking about this Expendables movie. I mean, Seagal was like, he was definitely conspicuously absent from any of those. I think, he kind of probably didn't get along with certain people in that group there, but he, for the big names that were in all those movies, he was not in them.
Yeah. Well, Matt, this has been a ton of fun. Like I said, I love chatting with you, and I hope to have you back on again sometime soon. So if there of any of these 40 projects that Dolph has done post Expendables, any of these strike your fancy, please hit me up, and we'll pencil something in. Okay.
Yeah, you know me. You had me on for Final Inquiry. Anytime it's Dolph, I'm happy to talk about it. Doesn't matter what it is.
Right on. Cool. Well, hey, to everyone out there who is listening, please feel free to rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you go to subscribe. We always appreciate the reviews, and we'll see you all next time on I Must Break This Podcast.